Welcome to Grief is the New Normal. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, a licensed psychologist and grief specialist, here to help change the conversation about grief and build community and connection while we all adjust to this new normal we are living in. This podcast is for you if you are grieving or if you are supporting someone in a season of grief. I'm glad you're here. Welcome back, everyone. I am so thrilled for today's conversation. Joining us, we have Dr. Jessica Thomas, PhD. Do you mind introducing a bit about yourself?
Okay. Formally, I have a PhD in psychology with an emphasis in transpersonal psychology. And then my master's is in marriage, couple, and family therapy. And I am clinically licensed in both Kansas and Oregon.
Okay.
And of course, I have an area of focus in death, dying, and grief.
I'm not as familiar with transpersonal psychology. Do you mind sharing a bit about that and how you see that influencing your understanding of grief and loss?
I appreciate transpersonal psychology when it comes to death and dying and grief because it situates the experience as part of a larger development process. And we look at psychospiritual development and the various stages. And grief and loss is a large part of that process. And gaining awareness and moving towards understanding the connections that we share. And I can tell you a little bit about what inspired me to move in the direction of transpersonal psychology. Yeah. In part, I began my work in the PTSD clinic at the VA. And I was very fortunate to work with a really skilled psychologist and expert in the field, Dr. Crosby. And I helped co-facilitate therapy groups there. And I distinctly remember a group session where Dr. Crosby passed out a handout that we reviewed, and it enumerated basically stages of healing and also psychospiritual development stages. And that presentation captivated the group members, and immediately they became curious and wanted to understand how they might evolve and grow and move through it and up towards the top where it's basically outlined a higher level of awareness and healing and enlightenment. And so it was so captivating. After that group session, there was a noticeable shift, a shift in attentiveness, curiosity, willingness to share, a sense of openness. I really realized then that I wanted to pursue whatever that was.
Wow.
And subsequently, that was integrating spirituality and psychotherapy, which is transpersonal psychology.
Amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's what I'm hearing is a deepening, like a permission to think differently about themselves, and that opened up a different level of connection in that group therapy space.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so how do you see that applying to grief work?
Yeah. I think grief is a large part of being human and having the ability to create meaning from our experiences. And I think that's valuable to also understand our pain and suffering is not just ours, but it's something that everyone experiences. And so when we are inspired to get outside of ourselves, I think that is the opening.
I talk about with my clients, grief is a universal lived experience.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something we are all going to experience, whether it's a physical death loss, a non-death loss. And that shared pain can be unifying and connecting and figuring out how do we move forward? What does it look like to hold space for that kind of pain, for that kind of loss, for the changes that come with that, those ripples. That's so cool.
Yeah. And I want to say, though, on that note, that folks will say that death is the great unifier or something like that. But grief is not equal. And because there's so many complex layers. And so although we all die, we don't all grieve the same.
No.
And we have extraordinarily different grief experiences. And so I think that's an important aspect.
Absolutely. Yeah. there's not one right way to grieve. It's not a linear process, and
Mm.
different losses are going to impact us in different ways in different seasons of life, with depending on who the person was, how old we were, what kind of
Yeah.
support we had. There's so much nuance in grief
Hmm.
that grief is not a unifier. Like, it's, we all will experience it in some ways, but how we experience it is vastly different.
Yeah.
We talk about a spectrum of grief. On one end, you've got like the instrumental, stoic, doer, internal experience. The other end, you've got the intuitive, emotive, externalizer type of grief. And you
Yeah.
can fall on different ends of that spectrum in different seasons with different losses. And I think so often we compare how our grief shows up compared to those around us. And it's, oh, am I doing this right? Does it feel good for you? Does it feel like that's honoring for you and where you're at? Then great,
Hmm.
you're doing it right for you. But there's a
Right.
spectrum to it. If my partner is not crying about it, they're not talking about it, that doesn't mean they're not feeling it. That doesn't mean they're not
Hmm.
grieving. It just means it
Hmm.
might look different than how you're grieving.
Yeah, absolutely. Hmm.
With the work that you do, because you do research, you're in academia, you're a clinician, what unique insights do you think you've gained about how society approaches or avoids conversations around death?
A few things. There is the fact that most people die in institutional care settings, which is removed from everyday life. And
Mm,
that in and of itself can prevent normative response to death.
yeah.
And the dying process is then can be pathologized or medicalized and removed from our participation in it. So there's this space that's created that fosters that removal. And so when I ask people if they have ever sat with a dying person and or with a dead body, it's very few actually.
Yeah.
And when I ask that question, a lot of people give me a strange answer or look, or sorry, here, nix that. When I ask that question, usually I'm met with a surprising look, like, why would you ask me that? So, I mean, that in and of itself, that response says a lot. And then, of course, the answer itself, which is very few, will say they've sat with a dead body or sat with somebody who was actively dying.
Yeah.
Hmm. So we're pretty removed from that as a society. And then, for the most part, we're told that death is an emergency.
Mhm.
Call the professionals.
I
Remove the
love,
body.
yeah, death is an emergency. Yes. Oh my
Mhm.
God.
And of course, sometimes it is, but obviously, I'm referring to the times when it's not,
When I when I started grad school, I'd experienced traumatic loss. It was like they were here and then they weren't.
Yeah.
And so when I started grad school, I was like, I want to understand the slow goodbye. So I started volunteering with hospice. And so I
Yes.
became a bereavement volunteer for the first 4 years of my doctoral program. And
Yeah.
I was a vigil volunteer. Like, I'd go to class from 6 to 10 at night because it was an evening program
Yes.
for working adults. And then
Mhm.
I would go
Mhm.
and do a vigil from like
Yeah.
night to 4 a.m. Or I'd go to the hospitals and check on patients that were in the hospital. But rarely was it going to someone's home, but it was in a hospital or it was in a assisted
Mhm.
living or assisted care facility. And yes,
Mhm.
it was respite care and giving the family a break from holding vigil. But some families or individuals, they didn't have people to sit vigil.
Yeah.
So it was, yeah, it was interesting. I got to sit with three bosses or CPs
Yeah.
before they passed. And then you go through the process of connecting either with the family or with the care
Mhm.
facility and making sure things get wrapped up. But it's not, it was slow, it was quiet, it was calm,
Mhm.
it wasn't this emergency. So
Mhm.
that's such an interesting concept, thinking of typical day to
Mhm.
day, death is an emergency.
Mhm.
Yeah, I haven't heard it that way yet.
Yeah, I think hospice, I just wish everybody would volunteer for hospice at some point in their lives because I think it gives such a wonderful perspective.
Yeah.
And then in some ways, I feel that death is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So we see death in the news and social media, but there seems to be a lack of real conversation
Mm.
that follows those experiences. And in particular, when we see more complicated deaths and brutality, and maybe we try to avoid the impact that has on us, and we
Mm.
potentially numb ourselves to get through and quote unquote stay productive.
Yeah.
And that sort of leads me to my other point in that there is an impulse to stay productive. right? And it's so deeply ingrained within us. And in most cases, productivity is understood as like literally producing something of value. And in our culture, we tend to see value in something that can be capitalized on, right? What's usually needed in grief is just the space to feel and to locate our feelings and understand how we feel about something, about grief and loss. And we just don't make the space or time, or we don't have the luxury,
right, the privilege
of the time and space to do that. And I'm sure you hear this in your clinical work as well, as the dissonance we often encounter, and that the conflict between the way we are experiencing grief internally and the way we express it outwardly or we don't express it, which produces so much disharmony and creates more of a vulnerability to unhealthy grieving. So there's the way we go to work, we try to go through the motions, but there's such a contrast to how we feel inside and then what's going on outside, that they don't match up. And so that creates some frustration and even anger.
Yeah. And I would even add in like the confusion there too,
Mm-hmm.
because grief is more than just being sad.
Mm-hmm.
And you said like having the space to figure out what we feel about it, whether that's anger, relief, guilt, sadness, fear, a myriad of emotions. It's complicated and we don't always have the space or even the emotional intelligence to figure out what the complicated feelings are, because we might have been raised in a home where we didn't talk about feelings. We didn't have that model for us. And so now we're trying as adults to figure out, what did I feel about that? What does that mean for me? How does that influence who I am, how I relate to others, and doing all that within your 3 days of bereavement leave. And then, so it's another great point. Like, it's hard, it's complicated, and we don't have the space to figure that out. Like, it feels safer to have that dissociative doom scrolling or the numbing, or I'm just going to work and be in that hyper produce mode. Rather than acknowledging that, oh, my capacity is impacted right now because my grief is impacting me physically, emotionally, mentally, socially, spiritually, all of the things. And yet, no, it's just being sad. And now I'm sad and I'm going to go back to work. There's that dissonance there.
And certainly sometimes working can be helpful, right? Sure. It's not always harmful or bad, right? It can feel good and that's okay. But at the times we feel like we're not able to honor or express our grief, that can become problematic.
Yeah. It's that oscillation, right, between the grief work and the restorative work. And so like, when we come up for air, maybe it does feel good to be at work and producing and connecting and being around others. And then you have to balance that out by doing some of that internal reflection and the deep dive and the grief work, because it doesn't go away. Like, it stays in us. And like you said, that can turn into unhealthy grief.
Yeah.
So in your work, like which I think this is so cool, you integrate a lot of mindful photography as part of your reflective practice, grief practice. How do you see that as an effective grief tool?
In my recent book, Choosing Light, in the intro, I tell a story about caregiving for my grandmother and how in those final days, I instinctively used the camera to stay grounded and really present through that experience. And it's really helped me be there. And then those images that I made at that time, I could then go back and reflect on the experience and see through my eyes at that time, but also reflect more deeply and see beyond the image and see a story, the symbolism, the deeper meanings, and the image that the image portrayed. And there's a spark of curiosity that's inspired there. I found that I could hold more than just sorrow. And so it became a lifeline for me through that grief journey. And so it can help create the time to be with whatever is present inside and making contact with that part of ourselves. And then there's more because you have an image that reflects that, right? That's something that's inside of you. And it's a way to further deepen that process. And so with the caregiving, my original research study was with those who were anticipating the loss of a loved one, right? Caregivers found that it was helpful. It was a gentle way and a non-confrontive way, accessible way to be and explore what they were feeling. And so it helped them to mediate potentially any anxiety or anticipation that was going on. But then it also, like I said, became a path to meaning making and deeper reflection. So I really appreciate the wholeness of the practice because it uses the visual imagery along with the narrative. Mm-hmm.
I think that's so cool because photography is so accessible these days. Like everyone has a camera on their phone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that can be such a beautiful way to document things that stand out to you, that when we're in that pre-grief, anticipatory grief, it can feel like time's moving so slow and so fast.
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like sand through your finger. We only have so much, we don't know how much, and it feels almost like a panic that am I going to have enough time? And so I love that you utilize photography to help ground and slow and capture things that stood out to you, and then you were able to reflect on it later. Like what a cool process of like awareness. That's amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then of course, like the subsequent work was integrated into not just anticipatory grief, but bereavement and then lingering grief years later, the grief that still bubbles up or pieces that are unresolved in relationships.
With that mindful photography practice, you use that in therapy groups, right?
Yeah. So the practice that I created is called Within and Without. And it's a program, it's a method that I use both in individual work and in group.
And what would you say are some of the takeaways that your participants have had?
Yeah, it's always so interesting because there is never the same thing that happens, right? It's always so unique. A lot of folks are surprised with insights and awareness that expand from their images and the sharing process. So that's one thing, is that there's this unknown element to it. And so that kind of makes way for a surprise. And group participants show up not really quite knowing what they'll experience. And that mirrors grief. We don't know. We don't know what's going to happen next. We don't know the feeling that's going to come up next. And so the process very much mirrors grief, especially the beginning of the practice. And group participants come in willing to lean into the experience of the unknown, right? And a lot of times folks will be like, I don't know if I'm going to be doing it. I don't think I can really come up with anything. I'm not an artist. I'm not a writer. I'm not. And I always encourage them to say, and I say, put that aside. It's not about any of that. And so they lean into the within and without practice for themselves with a bit of curiosity. And it only takes a small spark of curiosity and it creates an opening, right? And then the reflection process is expanded within the group. It does require that vulnerability to share, and that begins to expand the openings. And then the creativity just begins to flow and it just pours out. And it's magical. It's hard to describe, really. It's really unlike any other grief group experience, so I'm told. And in some way, I feel that when we turn toward that creativity within us, healing and connection just lead the way and take over.
I want to recommend that to my clients. Also, I could see how that would be very different than a traditional, like a grief share. Love me some grief groups. When I was at hospice as a bereavement intern, we ran multiple groups a week. And I think my favorite groups were always the ones that had creative elements because, like you said, that willingness to be curious about how can I get outside of my head and think about this in a different way and see what comes up or engage with the material and allow myself to not have a foregone conclusion of what I'm going to learn. Curiosity is the most neutral emotion we can have. If we can move into that space of curiosity, we don't know what way it's going to go.
Yeah. I think curiosity is also the most authentic place to be.
Yes. Especially with grief. You're just being present. You're staying in that moment.
Yeah. And so if we are open to leaning into the curiosity and being in that space of the unknown more intentionally, we learn so much more about ourselves and those connections. And we also cultivate this ability to stand firmly even in the midst of ambiguity. And there's something very strengthening about that. And so participants often will say after a group session and even individual session, they'll say, I can't believe what came out.
Yeah.
I could have never imagined this coming out of me, this insight, this awareness. Like I didn't even, they have no idea, right? And so they're always that surprise element. And that creates a sense of empowerment.
Yeah.
A faith in one's own ability. So there's less of this concern of, am I doing this right? Which often becomes a barrier. And there's more of this, like, even more expansion of curiosity and the desire to follow that curiosity. And so it cultivates even more faith in oneself and not having to often be anxious or I don't know if I'm doing this right. I don't know if I'm perceiving this right. So it's very empowering.
Absolutely. And then to have other people showing up in that same degree of authenticity and vulnerability. And like, even though their grief experience is unique to them, like you guys are grieving together. And this is a way we can relate to how others are grieving. And it's, oh, that's such a good insight, or I hadn't thought of it that way. And it just, I think it builds that library to help normalize grief.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And being seen is so powerful. And then witnessing others in their process is so powerful. So there's just so many elements that come together in these sessions. I also want to say that something about the title of my book, Choosing Light. Yeah. And I want to talk about that for a moment because the title is in reference to the camera shining light on something, right? To see it and understand it. And I don't mean as a way of bypassing one's suffering or some sort of like toxic positivity, like this notion of, oh, if I could just see the light, if I could only see the positive aspects of this, that's not what I'm saying, right? I'm saying that you can have the courage to shine a light on something and to explore it, even the difficult parts, right? And to hold both, to explore all of it.
I love that. I think that's such a great, insightful title. And you're right, like with grief, it's not pretty. And some social media, there can be a lot of that toxic positivity and good vibes only. And there isn't that in the grief space. And I think trying to force people into that, it's not going to work. It's not going to last. It's not going to fit, and it's going to do more harm. And so I think choosing light, like a willingness to be brave, to be curious at the hard and the joy. Because again, grief is more than one thing. It's not just being sad. And there can be some joy in that grief space and learning how to hold that. And also there can be a lot of ugly and uncomfortable. And I think giving yourself permission to capture that, to look at it fully instead of looking at anywhere else. That's such a smart title. I love that.
Yeah. And oftentimes there's a sense of agency in this. Like I can choose how I want to proceed. And that's a shift from something terrible has happened to me to how do I want to proceed? What does this mean for me? So there is that sense of agency in that process.
Yeah, you're right. Like we didn't choose this. We didn't choose to be in this state of grief. So what choice can I make for myself now to help me maybe feel more empowered in how I want to grieve, in what I want to learn about myself from this process?
Yeah, and I think that's what comes out of it, but it's not the front door.
No.
curiosity is. The invitation to be curious, that is really the most important piece of this practice, I think.
You mentioned a need for social grief support rather than isolation. In what ways do you think society can better support people in grief? And how can communities help break down that isolation space around it?
Yeah. It's a big question, but I do think death and grief education is a good start.
Mm.
So I try to integrate death education wherever I can, including my clinical work and my classes, but then also within the community, right? My work as a board member for Northwest Association of Death Education and Bereavement Support is to integrate quality death education into the greater community and create spaces for that and opportunities for folks to learn and to understand it. And so I think death education is a good start. And then opening up the conversations wherever you can to normalize those discussions and creating the safe spaces where grief can be held, explored, and expressed. So, in particular, for those who experience complicated and stigmatizing death, though that creates a vulnerability and a prevalency to isolation and shame. So we need to destigmatize these conversations. And there is an element to the within and without practice that I think can do that. It's a way of having those conversations through a creative lens and expressing ourselves. So I look forward to creating more of those groups for community to explore and express and hopefully help make that shift.
In a similar vein of how as a society can we better support people, you advocate also for a more death accepting society through your different work avenues. What steps do you think are essential for making this cultural shift, and what role do you see education playing?
Yeah, everyone deserves the space to grieve, first and foremost, and we need to believe that. And I think education can help humanize grief. So believing that grief is an integral part of being human and an important part of growth, right?
Yeah.
And embracing the ability to create meaning in and of one's own life. I hope more folks can see the value in that process and then also consider its collective impact, right? When folks get the space to explore their grief, and we can see a larger impact of that in society.
Absolutely. When we're able to do it in a collective way, it reduces that isolation. It reduces the acuity of it in some ways, because we're not the only ones carrying the memory of the person, remembering their name. And so when we're able to be in spaces where we can have others grieve with us, remember their names, remember stories. It's the 15-year anniversary of my brother passing. And so we're getting together as a family and we're going to share stories about Garrett. And we've done this almost every year since he passed. And it helps so much. When some people are like, what, it's been 15 years and you're not over it? I'm like, yeah, it was my brother. It's not something to get over. It's part of me. My grief is part of me. And having people show up to support us, to share stories, to remember him with us, even if it's been 15 years, even if it's been 40 years, it's feeling less alone in being the ones remembering him and that he had an impact.
Yeah. And also making space for that evolving relationship, as we call continuing bonds. That's a healthy aspect of the journey, is that we can continue those bonds. It's an evolving relationship. Yeah.
I went to a training in Oregon with Robert Niemeyer, and one of the things he talked about in that training that's really stuck with me, and this was 12, 13 years ago, is it's learning how to say hello again in a new way. And that it's not this forever goodbye. And I love that concept, in that we don't have to just close the door and be done. We get to carry our person with us. We get to continue that relationship. It just looks different, and that needs to
Mm-hmm.
be okay. It's not weird. It's not doing something wrong. It's this person was a huge part of me. This is a person I thought I was going to continue to do life with. And now I just have to figure out how to do that in a different way.
That's also one of the chapters in my book. I talk about continuing bonds and how that came up in people's experiences with the with and without method. And it comes up in many ways in terms of symbolism and what folks see in a photograph and the connection between what we notice in our environment and what that resonance with objects or within nature and the presence that we can feel.
So as we start to wrap up this great conversation, what would you say are one or two really key takeaways when thinking about grief and that mindful photography practice?
Yeah. I think that, let's see, curiosity, the willingness to step into that curiosity, and the experience of sharing and exploring your experience alongside others. Because I think it's the recognizing the interdependent nature that is also the healing ingredient alongside curiosity. So interdependence and curiosity.
So when we think about moving forward, what are future projects and some research that you have going on? Are there any new areas of death education or psychospiritual development that you're hoping to pursue?
Yeah. There are so many interesting things happening that I'm excited about. Of course, my within and without professional trainings that kick off in January. I'm looking forward to sharing those. So, that training is for professionals in the field, in the death industry, or anyone working with grievers who are interested in learning the method and want to utilize it with their clients. So, that piece. And then I'm currently exploring how the within and without method helps mediate climate grief and anxiety.
Oh, interesting.
And then my new role on the board of AAMFT's interest group, Spirituality and Clinical Practice. I'm very much looking forward to connecting with colleagues who are also very interested in pursuing these meaningful topics.
You have some books coming out. Do you mind sharing a bit about that for our listeners so they can read what you have to say?
Yeah, sure. There's the book that just recently came out, Choosing Light, Transforming Grief Through Mindful Photography and Self-Reflection. And that is out. And you can find a link to that book on my website, or you can just simply Google the title and find it through Rowman and Littlefield or Amazon. And then I have a book chapter coming out in 2025 titled Contemplative Approach to Family Systems for the source book of Buddhist College Chaplaincy. So those are the current publications. Yep.
Awesome. And I will also make sure to include links to those in the show notes.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And if people are interested in working with you, what's the best way for them to connect with you? Are you on social media? You have some books coming out. Do you mind sharing a bit about that for our listeners so they can read what you have to say?
Yeah, sure. There's the book that just recently came out, Choosing Light, Transforming Grief Through Mindful Photography and Self-Reflection. And that is out. And you can find a link to that book on my website, or you can just simply Google the title and find it through Rowman and Littlefield or Amazon. And then I have a book chapter coming out in 2025 titled Contemplative Approach to Family Systems for the source book of Buddhist College Chaplaincy. So those are the current publications. Yep.
Awesome. And I will also make sure to include links to those in the show notes.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And if people are interested in working with you, what's the best way for them to connect with you? Are you on social media?
Yeah, my website is drjessica.com. And that's a hub for anything that you're wanting to know in terms of what's coming up next, what events, what workshops are coming up. And you can reach me from the contact on that website. I have Facebook and Instagram, which I update frequently. And so you can definitely find and a newsletter. You can sign up for my newsletter as well.
Awesome. Jessica, thank you so much for such a great conversation.
Thank you for having me.
All right, listeners, remember to be kind to yourselves today, and we'll see you next time. Take care. That's all for today's episode of Grief is the New Normal. If today's conversation resonated with you, I invite you to share it with someone who might need it. And if you're looking for more support or resources, feel free to head over to The Morning Movement, where we continue to build community and normalize hard, beautiful parts of life. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, and until next time, be kind to yourself. Opening and closing music is provided by the Datacorns. If you're interested in being a guest on the podcast, collaboration, or training opportunities, feel free to email me at hello@griefisthenewnormal.com. And podcasts are also now available streaming on YouTube.